Welcome to the Behaviour Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behaviour Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. Today in the podcast, we have Cammie Williams. Welcome to the podcast, Cammie.
Thank you.
I emphasize Williams today because I was doing a little research, I think yesterday, and on one place I saw Morgan, on one place I saw Cammie D. And I was like, do I got it right?
Yes, you do.
Yeah, that's awesome. Good. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that I'm producing this podcast in the lands of the Klomaks, Homoko, Klehus, and Kalaman First Nations, who were one nation before we settlers came in and separated them into reserves. Another First Nation that's actually also really close to my home is called the Shisha First Nation. Folks that live in my neck of the woods will know this as the community of Seashelt, which is about 100K from where I live, also on this area called the Sunshine Coast, kind of a small area in Western Canada. And some folks will be familiar. I talk a lot about sort of residential schools and a lot of the awful stuff that's happened at those places sort of up until recent times and quite a bit in the 19th century. Folks will be familiar with what happened, sort of probably the second biggest, sort of event that kind of shocked the world in terms of, racism and whatnot. George Floyd was the biggest, I think, but not far away was a year later, almost to the date, was the discovery of the 215 child graves at the former Indian residential school in Kamloops at Kamloops First Nation. And I think since then, another 9,500 graves have been found. Anyway, every time this kind of happens, it not only shocks the nation, but re-traumatizes folks. So just for folks that might be triggered by some of this stuff, maybe just hit pause for the next couple minutes or fast forward, because I wanted to read a bit a little statement that I found on the Shisha Nation webpage. They discovered, so yesterday, I think they announced another scan was completed. They've been using this ground penetration radar in all these Indian residential school sites to sort of locate these. And on the Shisha Nation, they found 40 more graves a couple days ago, all very small, compacted, shallow, essentially, obviously for children, but so shallow that it would have been all children in the fetal position, buried in these mass graves on the site of the St. Augustine Residential School. So I'm just reading this thing from the chief and council of the Shisha Nation. We write to you today to inform you of the results of the ground penetrating radar investigation of the former Indian residential school site that was on the lands of the Shisha Nation. This is a very challenging time for all the survivors who attended the institution, families of students and communities, and for the Shisha Nation. Our focus throughout the upcoming community meetings will be on supporting survivors, community members, and staff through sacred ceremony and cultural practices. It should be made clear that the results of the St. Augustine field investigations should in no way be seen to validate or invalidate the experiences of survivors or the knowledge held by families of those who attended. Whether or not unmarked graves are found, there is enough documented oral and archival evidence to say that these burials do or did exist. The news of unmarked graves at residential schools across Canada have been deeply painful and incredibly challenging for Shisha people and for all Indigenous peoples across Canada. The truth is being heard by many settler Canadians in new ways. Information Indigenous people have been telling Canadians for generations. There are many more truths that will be heard in the coming months, and it's a horrifying and devastating history that must be grappled with. This is an important time of reckoning for Canada, a time where history must be examined, current inequities scrutinized, and a fundamentally new path charted. We must find a path towards truth, justice, and unity. This new path will create great change for all of us. It requires individuals and collectives to re-examine their place in Canadian society and how they are contributing to and or hindering a more equitable future. This change will be hard. Growth often is. The Honorable Jody Wilson-Raybould recently reminded us of Chief Joe Mathias's words. Behold the turtle, he moves forward when he sticks his head out. It is time for bold actions that shift our reality, actions that push us to grow, actions that shift our hearts. Shisha has continued to show Canadians how and when our hearts and minds are in the right place, and change can happen quickly. On behalf of the Haggis and Council, Stephen Feschuk. I share all this, I think, just to get the word out to folks, especially kind of around the world that may not be familiar with some of the stuff that's happened in Canada and the US. A lot of these schools are in the US as well. But also because I know that the Tla'amin Nation, on which most of the area I live in is part of, I know a few folks up there, and a lot of the folks in Tla'amin have families that were in Shisha and in that school. If anyone, might be triggered by some of this stuff, I'm sure you will be. You can always call the Indian Residential School Hotline at 1-800-726-0066. And if folks are just looking to sort of put their money where their mouth is, Indian Residential School Survivor Society, which runs the hotline, is a great organization to donate to. So with that, I bring us back to Cammie.
Thank you for sharing that. That's absolutely just heartbreaking. Thank you for sharing that and acknowledging that.
Yeah, you bet. So today we're going to be talking about burnout. And as soon as I say that, I know probably half people listening are going, wait a second, I've heard a podcast on burnout. Yeah, so have I. Wait, there's 18 of them. And not to say that any of those are problematic or bad. They're all really informative and good ones. In fact, I think you yourself, Cammie, have done presentations and spoke on sort of, things with self-care and all those sorts of things, which are absolutely important. But we're going to be talking about sort of a different angle on burnout. We'll get to that. But I think it's an important conversation because we keep trying to treat the symptoms, and we need to talk a little more about some of the causes, because we shouldn't have to. So a lot of folks shouldn't have to deal with this kind of sort of trauma and burnout on a daily basis and have tools to deal with that. We need to be doing a lot more work in terms of dealing with that. In fact, we're going to touch on this, but I just want to say this while it's in my head, but I want to get an introduction to you first. I was reading a LinkedIn post from, I'm going to butcher the name, so I won't even say, but an Indigenous social worker that I'm going to be having on the podcast soon. Autumn Blackdeer, that's her name. And she's been sharing a lot recently about sort of the idea that it's in a similar way that, it's not sort of about sort of, and I'm butchered, I got to find the post, but basically it's not about decolonizing it's not just about decolonizing sort of the programs and the things that are happening, but it's about sort of getting the idea that all these systems are still so white centric. And so, again, she was talking about sort of a similar angle that we're kind of, we're doing cultural adaptations and cultural responsiveness and all these kinds of things, which are great, but what we're doing is we're essentially adapting and modifying essentially these white centered devices and assessments and programs and whatnot. And so instead of looking at the white centeredness, we're just trying to say, okay, well, it's white centered, but we'll fix it and make it less white centered. And I thought that was really, really, really telling about kind of what's happening. But pause that. We'll come back to that thought. I want to just learn a little bit more about you, Cammie.
Sure.
Kind of, a bit would be your origin story, kind of how you got into the field and kind of how that got you to where you are now.
Yeah. So I completed my undergrad degree in 2013 from Western Michigan University. And so some of the psych courses that I had to take included ABA. I did not like ABA. The way it was taught was at that time very rote, and my brain just doesn't work, I guess, that way. But nonetheless, I was a psych major. I needed a job, and a company hit me up out of Indiana. And I was like, okay, cool. Like, I got a job, because my dad was always grilling me about my psych degree, and I need to have a job after graduation. So I moved to Indiana, and I started working at this clinic, and just it completely changed my life, because I was able to actually see the science in real practice with my clients. I was able to really just connect with so many of my clients, their families, their loved ones. And that's really how I kind of stumbled upon ABA. Many years later, I ended up moving to Charlotte, North Carolina. And again, I found a clinic, and it just made me fall in love with the science and the field even more. And so, yeah, I went back to school, got my master's from Nova Southeastern University in counseling, with an emphasis on ABA. And it's taken me thus just to where I am now, where I really try to take an approach where I'm really looking at like just the internal family system, not just like that immediate environment, but really just kind of in a more contextual way, kind of who this client is overall, why some of these things are happening, if they're even inappropriate outside or appropriate, inside or outside this kind of internal family system, and just going from there. So since then, I have met my now wife. I'm a military spouse. So originally, when I passed my boards, we were in Hawaii. So I was able to practice there. And again, I was able to really utilize my passion for just seeing the world in a very contextual, intersectional lens. Just helping out, or trying at least to help out, some of the clients that was referred to me out of the Hawaii DOE. I now reside in Maryland. And so, yeah, aside from the work I do clinically, I have my own podcast, Love, Sex, and Applied Behavior Analysis. And I also have another company called Becoming Unfuckwithable, where both of these things are really just a matter of utilizing the science, really for ourselves, but also talking about just the world around us in a behavior analytic and positive psychological way, with a lot of roots and a lot of context from just a very intersectional, but specifically a pro-Black lens. So yeah, I feel like that was a mouthful. That's a little bit about me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I also see your name, and of course the podcast kind of hints at that, but I also see your name quite a bit in sort of the ABA kind of sexuality spaces. What have you done a lot of work in that area? Did you do some sort of specialized training there? Like what made you go that direction?
I never, ever wanted to be just like a traditional BCBA. My interests have always kind of outlined outside of that. And one of the things that's really intriguing to me is the relationship between the patriarchy, religion, and specifically the impact that has on the global majority and our sexuality and our sexual expression. And so a lot of the work that I tend to do is really kind of helping people to see that a lot of what may be maintaining something, such as like their lack of orgasm, to their lack of belief in, I don't know, like masturbation, like just all these kind of like self-love things, how a lot of them are rooted in the patriarchy and anti-Blackness and just all the things. So yeah, I dibble and dabble.
I know it's not the focus of today, but could you unpack that a bit? How that stuff is rooted in the patriarchy and anti-Blackness?
Yeah. So We know that pleasure is like a direct juxtaposition of oppression, right? And I think for most people who identify as women, typically our identities have all been wrapped around male pleasure. And so so it kind of begs the question, like, well, who are we? One, if we don't want, or we don't operate our lives at the hands of men and their pleasure. But also, who are we when we just want to have sex just to orgasm, or not even if orgasming in this case is the end goal, right? Like, who are we if we really just want to feel pleasure? And we know that many religions kind of uphold this idea that women are only supposed to be the producers, you know what I mean, to kind of keep all of the little humans kind of going.
Yes.
And so it's okay that we allow other people to feel pleasure by, doing things that are negatively reinforcing to them, such as like the housework and the child rearing and the child raising and all that kind of stuff. But really, it's like, who are we if we're centering our own pleasure, in this case, our own sexual pleasure? So who am I if I am married and I still like to masturbate on my own? Or who am I if I am a sex worker and I refuse to be shamed about that? Who am I if, I am a trans person and I'm not, disclosing or, my identity to someone, and I still expect to be able to have sex with them and still be alive after that interaction. And so really a lot of my goal in life is, you'll hear me say this all the time, is like centering the most marginalized person within any context, any given context that I'm referring to. And typically when it comes to pleasure, in particular, just sexual pleasure, the people that I try to center the most are the disabled identities, the neurodiverse identities, the fat identities, the trans and non-binary identities, Black and brown identities, because if we can successfully do that and continuously do that, then I think it will kind of open up this whole world of pleasure for all of us.
Love it. That's
Thank
awesome.
you.
Yeah. I see another podcast coming. And it also reminds me of sort of an online conversation that I think you and I were involved in a little bit when I impulsively created the Behavior Analysts with No Kids Facebook page, and you and a couple other folks brought up some really important points that have caused me to reflect quite a bit. And also, I think there's actually someone I might be having on soon, talking about sort of, kind of how, our systemic racist structures play into sort of mothering and pregnancy and maternal care and whatnot. And the point that, it's also a point of, because like you said, women are expected to have children and bear children and so on and so forth. And that the systems are actually designed so that, things like contraception and abortion and other sorts of, what do we call that sort of broad category of women's health are suppressed by sort of the systems of government and patriarchy and so on and so forth. And so, point being that starting a Facebook page called Behavior Analysts Who Don't Have Kids is a very privileged perspective. Are you a BCBA supervisor looking to streamline your practice? Or maybe you're working towards your BCBA and need to find the right supervisor. Whomhouse offers tools that make supervision so much more enjoyable for both supervisor and supervisee. For supervisors, they offer easy meeting documentation, competency tracking, monthly verification forms, a built-in supervision curriculum, and so much more. For supervisees, Whomhouse has a fieldwork tracker with built-in auditing, monthly verification forms, a curriculum, quizzes, and more. If you're looking for a supervisor, they even have a supervision marketplace where you can connect with BCBAs until you find your perfect match, kind of like professional dating. For more information, go to whomhouse.com/speak or search Whomhouse on Google. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is burnout. There may be many folks that could join that group, people that don't want kids, but have them, or been forced to have them, and so on. It's not all as simple as you think it is.
Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
But sorry, folks, not the topic for today. Next time, maybe. When I met with you prior to talk about sort of what you want to talk about, burnout was a thing that was really of mind, and so sort of some of those kind of systemic issues and whatnot contributing to burnout. So a lot of people talk about burnout, and let me first off give us maybe an idea of sort of how you define burnout, because burnout can have a lot of different sort of, topographies and presentations and what does sort of burnout mean to you?
Yeah. I think that the way burnout is being talked about, like in mainstream media, I think if I had to, like, on my feet, kind of think of an operational definition, I would define it as like this feeling or this sensation that white people have now that they are sick and tired of being sick and tired. I think that is like the epitome of what it is now. I think on a deeper level, burnout, I think, really kind of comes from, I think burnout is almost like this response to an awakening that tends to happen. But when you don't have the privilege, oftentimes, of kind of like moving and shifting, whether it's to a different environment, to a different job, to a different career, whatever, it's kind of like this awakening that happens in the absence of the privilege to really do something about it. And again, at least to me, a lot of this, if not all of this, directly stems from kind of what I kind of would quantify as just white supremacy culture, racism, specifically anti-Blackness, and for sure, just anti like the global majority. So yeah, I think that's the fastest thing I could come up with just now. But yeah, I think that's at least the way I see it.
That is awesome. And I say that, so I've had a few guests on recently, and folks have been kind of asking why I do this podcast and why I tend to have, folks that aren't white on the podcast. And one of the big reasons, there's a couple. First, obviously, I want to support and uplift and get voices out there and all that, but also it's the perspective without privilege that I have just been eaten up and loving. And it just shows such a different sort of, such a much more world view of everything. I would have expected a burnout definition to sort of just be, I'm overworked, I'm tired, I'm stressed, whatever, and your definition is just like, bam, that's what it really is. Burnout, and it's true. I think a lot of the sort of concepts of stress and anger and anxiety and whatnot, most of them are white-centered, white, privilege based definitions. I think your point about sort of, we're just starting to feel, some of this stress and wear out. Whereas, as I've learned, in recent years, most folks that aren't white, have not only been experienced levels of this from the moment they came out of the womb, but also in the womb and intergenerationally and genetically and ancestrally and ceremonially, and if that's a word, and it's just it's a completely different picture, and I think I think I'm kind of tangenting here, but I think we need to really look at our definitions of everything.
100%.
And unpack them in a different way, because that's a great off the cuff definition. I can only imagine, if I gave you time to prepare, what that would sound like. So, and I think it's really important that you define burnout this way, because it also then changes how we address it.
Because I think it puts it allows for us to also understand that we have a hand in our own oppression, right? Like I think oftentimes when we think about the system, or we think about like the man or the machine or whatever, we forget that we're the ones like manually turning that wheel. You know what I mean? And I think sometimes it could be really, really hard for us to really kind of realize that. One of the things, like even in my bio, like I explicitly put just a few of my intersections, because it's really important for me to center the fact that, like, as a Black cis, or not, well, cis, excuse me, but lesbian, but feminine presenting person, like I still also uphold a lot of privilege, right? And I think sometimes I see this a lot, especially with white women. There's this sense of like this is daunting. Like I always give the example, the whole Handmaid's Tale, where, so many women with that show identify as June. And in reality, they're Aunt Lydia. Like they are bought into the system.
Right.
They are literally birthing, marrying, procreating the system, while also kind of, I think in this case, having this new kind of awakening of like, oh shit, like I'm actually being oppressed too. And I think we all do that in our various ways. And I think what we're seeing right now with burnout, really at large, but specifically in behavior analysis, I think we're kind of figuring out that like something's not right, but the things that aren't right are the things that arguably have never been right. You know what I mean? And it's like, so what do we kind of do about it? I personally think that the first thing we need to do about it is, in my opinion, like reframing the definition, but also like starting with just admitting, like, with all of our careers and all of our degrees and all of our supervision hours and all that stuff, a lot of us did not have exposure to like the real like healthcare system at large, right? So I know I didn't know about billable hours. I definitely have never taken a business class. Like I didn't know truly about like things like capitalism, you know what I mean? Or again, like the healthcare system and really how it worked at large. I knew that my people were oppressed by it. I knew kind of the complexities and some of the nuances, but like on a day-to-day basis, all I knew was like my dad had really good insurance. And so like when it came time to pay like my chemo treatments and things like that, like we were able to do that, right? Like, but I didn't really know, especially on like the practitioner side, that idea of like, but at what cost, right? Like I just had no idea. And so I think right now we're kind of in this shift where it's one, with the algorithm on social media, burnout is just something I think really good to talk about, depending on, what the function of your behavior is. But I don't think we really, really realize like we are talking about, we're kind of like whitewashing this in a way that is so harmful, especially to like the global majority that, to me, I tend to not touch on it for that reason, because I piss a lot of people off. I get a lot of mean inboxes, which I'm fine with, because I think if I'm making the right people mad, I'm doing my job. But I just don't know if at large, if we're really ready to kind of talk about it, Yeah,
no, 100% we aren't. Like all of that was cool. So in a bad way, but and I've heard, a lot of, sort of non-white folks talk about, and this intersectionality piece around,
Yeah.
around privilege. I mean, I think it's good to recognize that, but
Mm-hmm.
I think it also can be problematic to point that out,
Yeah.
because I can totally see, that white woman or that white man with privilege, with a
Mm-hmm.
whole lot of privilege, hearing you with all these intersectionalities talking about your privilege and
Mm-hmm.
going, oh, well, she's got privilege too, so
100%.
I'm not so bad, you
Yep.
know,
100%. Yeah.
and it's so interesting that it was that article when I remember I had Anita Lee on way back,
Mm-hmm.
and she did that article she wrote that article on solidarity between non-white professionals. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think the sort of Black professionals and Asian professionals and whatnot,
Yeah.
all having sort of similar experiences and kind of working together and acknowledging that even within your own sort of cultures, there's you're all human still. So there's
Yeah.
a lot of this stuff is still going on. But I feel like, I mean, I think you got to talk about it and you got to write about it. But I
Mm-hmm.
just worry that it for some folks, that kind of rhetoric is going to, make white folks work less harder on these
Well,
things, because
yeah,
they're like, well,
because
everyone's doing it. So
also behaviorally speaking, and again, I think we have to be really careful not to talk about this, any of these things in like this fluffy way, which I think a lot of people are doing.
mm,
And like marginalize people as well, because oftentimes we are heavily reinforced for talking about it in this way that makes people comfortable.
mm,
So for me, for example, like a lot of my experience has been the opposite, because I don't talk about it in this fluffy way.
mm,
Definitely, like I am not getting hit up for a lot of these opportunities, because I think my lived experience and also just my understanding and my knowledge of really the bigger picture it just won't allow me to, right? I think the reality is it is not comfortable and it's not easy, it's not pleasurable to do this kind of work.
mm,
And the second that it is, and I think DEI as a perfect example specifically to our field is a prime example. The second everybody's buying into it, I know we've done it wrong, because it literally is a matter of like overthrowing every single thing that we know. So I'll give you a personal example. A few years ago when I learned, and again, I'm saying a few years ago. So for context, I've been in the field since 2013. I have I struggle with like clinical depression and anxiety, PTSD. I also have ADHD. A few years ago, when I learned of the term ableism, it rocked my world, because I was like, what is that? Like, you know what I mean? And I pride myself again on centering the most marginalized, all this stuff. When I learned about ableism, I had to choose actively to not just like know what it was by definition and to kind of conceptualize it, but I had to actively choose if I was saying like I'm X, whatever these, self-proclaimed, adjectives that I wanted to give myself. I knew I had to intentionally choose on a daily basis to make that a conscious part of my being. So I always say to people, for example, like being Black to me is just a very conscious experience. And I think a lot of people who depending on like what their neurodivergence is, they can understand that consciousness where it's like you're always kind of in your head a lot, right? Because it's such a thoughtful experience. You have to be consciously aware of just about anything that you do, right? In my case, because of this Black skin. So when I learned about, and because of being in, especially to me, a feminine presenting woman. So when I learned about ableism, it was the exact same thing. I had to make it at the very conscious for me to truly be able to create spaces for people without them asking, without me having them like come on my podcast, without, them, performing at, a CEU event or whatever. But I had to make sure that like when I learned about it, if I was really this offended by it or really this, outraged by it or whatever, I knew I had to make it a conscious part of my existence to be conscious of it. The thing when it comes to oppression and racism and all these things, most of us have the privilege of these things not being our conscious experience. So there is kind of this like I'm checking all these boxes, I think kind of like process that many of us either have been on the receiving end of, or we may be the perpetrators of, because that's what we're taught to do. We're taught to check the boxes. And we see that through history, right? Like we saw literally after the civil rights movement, like when integration happened, like the work stopped, like because we checked the box, like there's no more black and white fountains and schools and all that stuff. And I also think too, we have to acknowledge like we're the generation of we don't see color because our parents were the generation of integration. Well, my grandmother was like working in people's homes, like the movie The Help. Like I saw that movie and I was deeply triggered because I'm like, that's my grandmother, my father's mother. My father went through school integration. And meanwhile, like I was a Black kid in the white ass suburbs because it was quote unquote like better opportunities and all this stuff, right? So I think there also is like sometimes this feeling of like really personalizing a lot of this stuff that a lot of people aren't really comfortable with doing. And I think for me, it's like, it just doesn't take anything away from me to be like, absolutely, I am inherently ableist. I am inherently transphobic. I am inherently like all these things. Because it's the truth. Like it's as true as the fact that like I'm recording this podcast with you right now. You know what I mean? I don't feel anything besides motivation to use that inherent, those like inherent privileges for the good. And I think a lot of people kind of get stuck with this like resistance to really kind of accepting like we all are inherently like flawed, I guess, for lack of a better word, because that's the way the system was designed. And we can't just like think that like hiring someone, like to be on like your DEI board or whatever, that like that's enough. And it's, I don't know. I personally am no longer interested in the whole like, oh, I'm listening and learning. I'm not interested in being the talker. I'm not just because I think the reality is like that it doesn't, when I think of efficacy, and on a big scale, I don't think that that's the most effective. And I think you're right. I think we either have this like push of like, oh no, like I have like an autistic person that's a BCBA at my company. Like we're good. Like we're good with like the neurodiversity movement or like, oh no, like, Cammie's doing my CEU or, I'm going to BabaCon or whatever. I'm good. Like I'm good on that. And that's just not, that's just not it.
We're never going to be good.
Yep.
Which is, I know it's a pessimistic, cynical way of looking at things, but you're absolutely right. And everything we have in the world was built on these, certainly in our world anyway, was in our North American westernized sort of world was built on this, white supremacist sort of structure, going all the way back. I mean, I remember when I had Tiffany Hammond on, and she was talking about, this was a time sort of during pandemic when, the anti-ABA conversation was really, really blooming, and it's still going strong right now, but it's actually a real white conversation,
100%,
and a white dominated conversation. In fact, a white autistic dominated conversation,
100%.
And it's and it's sort of, it's interesting. It's hard. I think it's hard for folks to sort of acknowledge that that you can be anti-ableist and racist at the same time.
Oh, yes. When I'll never forget when I came out, some of the most significant moments of experiencing racism that stand out to me happened at Pride. And I don't think people really get that. And in their minds, it really is like these rainbows and confetti, and all these things. And it's like, again, intersectionality is a thing. Like, and I don't think people are willing to really take into account just how deeply rooted this is. Like, I always wish that it would be ethical to like to be an experimenter and to create like a utopia, and then like the control group be like the real world, where, you know, in this utopia, there really is this like acknowledgement of all beings in a very like wholesome, you know, beautiful, whole kind of way. But obviously, just due to the ethical concerns that like that utopia in this experiment can't last forever. And if you put those hypothetical people back in the real world, that would create severe harm. But I really think that I wish that we could do that so people could really kind of see, like, I'm not saying that we're ever, and I don't believe, to your point, that like we're ever going to get to a place where like everything is perfect. And I don't know anybody that's saying that. I think what most of us, or at least what I'm saying, is, number one, we have to be willing to acknowledge that's fucked up. We have to be willing to acknowledge why it is, what part we are contributing to someone else's suffering, what part that we're contributing to our own suffering. And then like literally work together to be like, well, even if it's just for these 8 hours a day that you're here at my clinic, how can I make your suffering less? Maybe it's me just doing a preference assessment and giving you feedback via email versus in person. Maybe it's me having written and vocal and, you know, whatever else kind of instruction. Like I think sometimes people think that like a lot of the actions are a little bit like bigger than what they actually are, right? Like literally, like maybe it's like, you know, teaching your client how to mand in their native tongue. Like, you know what I mean? Like there really are these like simple but powerful ways to do this. And I just don't, I think if burnout is ever going to be used, at least in my vocabulary, I think like white people are burnt out from being talked about how racist they are. And so we're kind of seeing this like kind of this phase, right? Where, you know, we're kind of going right back to normal. And I don't know, it's hard for me to hear about burnout because, again, since the workforce in America was created, like we've been talking and feeling this way forever, and we've had no choice or the privilege or access to even speak about it because we needed a job, you know what I mean? And it's just, I think it's just a lot deeper than what people realize.
There is a lack of diversity when it comes to educational material depicting Black children in the field of applied behavior analysis. Human Expressions gives Black and brown children realistic and detailed images of kids who look like them, modeling everyday skills that may be difficult for them to communicate or express. At Human Expressions, the benefits of representation for Black and brown kids in educational curricula are clear. Increased self-esteem, reducing stereotypes, and increased validation and support. To learn more, go to www.humanexpressions.org. That's human, HUEMAN, expressions.org. The second secret words are beauty shop. Something I heard, and a lot of folks heard, you know, in sort of the immediate kind of months after the George Floyd murder, quite a bit, which I'm sure had a lot of white people struggling, was how tired Black folks were, how exhausted they were, and still are, and continue to be and have been forever. But, you know, because suddenly you've got, you know, this mass amount of white people that suddenly want to know, suddenly want to understand, suddenly want to relate and somehow connect somehow. be an ally, be an
Yeah.
accomplice, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so looking to the Black voices to fill them in. To now I want to know.
Yeah.
Now I
Yeah.
want to hear it. And I talked about the residential school experience in the beginning, and how and how the Shisha Nation in their statement even said that this stuff isn't new. You're listening now that these graves are here, but we've known they've been there since we went to these schools. We saw these people go missing, and we saw the burial plots outside, and no one wanted to know. No one wanted to hear about it. And so just that your point about sort of that we as white folks are now this is stressful, now this is hard, now it's hard to know that these people have been traumatized and hurt and whatnot, and I had like, no, I can't say that example. I'll get in trouble. But I've had conversations like that where like white folks have even tried to sort of relate to the residential school experience. I'm like, what?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
You can't relate. You have no idea. And so so now what's happening, and I think in our field, is I think when we look at the sort of the ableism intersection as well, is we have a lot of folks burning out because of how bad ABA suddenly is, and how we're suddenly not thinking of assent. We're not being compassionate. We're not being quote unquote trauma informed or trauma assumed. And we've applied all these sort of these labels to sort of alleviate us having to do any work. Like, I don't have to work on the white supremacist system because I now have identified my company as being trauma informed, neurodiversity affirming, anti-racist. I'm an anti-racist, and I'm an ally. And so problem solved.
Yeah. Well, it's matching law, right? It's easier to do those things.
Yes, right.
You know what I'm saying? And I think what I am saying is, like, I see right through it. And I see right through it because that is what my colleagues' parents did. That is what my colleagues' grandparents did, and so on and so forth. Like, and literally most times when I'm talking about this, at the end, they'll be like, hey, like, Cammie, can you give me a resource list? Like, what are you reading, or where can I read this or whatever? And I'm like, literally start with your grandma, start with your grandpa, like, talk to your people, because like, they know, like, you know what I mean? Like, they know, like, when we look at these pictures that have intentionally been only posted and recreated in black and white, if we know the psychological phenomenon between that and the perception of time, for example, like, then we know that this didn't happen like that long ago, right? Like, we know, like, talk to, like, why are you reading like White Fragility by this white lady over here? Like, talk to your parents, like, and I don't think people really kind of are willing to even do that, because there is this level of intimacy and fear that kind of comes along with like this awakening, right? Like, what if I thought that, like, I was raised by like, this was my experience of my parents, right? And I realized that, like, maybe there's also more to them. Like, maybe there is this socialized, this learned, conditioned repertoire of behaviors that, like, I didn't know about. And I think it could be that I think all of us, like, there comes a point in time, like, when you start to see your parents and your grandparents as like people, not just as like your experience of them as parents. And that can be really, really hard and scary. But when you really start to kind of see them possibly as people who also uphold systems of oppression and things like that, I think a lot of people are afraid to really combat that. And if you can't do that with like your parents or your grandparents or your great grandparents, but you're also comfortable like getting a 23andMe test to see like where your ancestors came from and all that kind of stuff, I'm probably not going to be the person that's going to be able to effectively educate you on this. You know what I mean? Because it's just not it. And also, if you can do that, but you also can't like first start with yourself and really start to figure out like how am I contributing to the system? And also, how am I contributing to my own oppression? Like, it's a revolutionary kind of act to do that many people have the privilege not to be forced to do, you know? Like, I remember somebody was asking me, like, if you could be any other race, like, would you, like, what race would you be? And I'm like, what do you mean? Like, I'd still be Black. Like, I love being Black. And they're like, really? And I'm like, absolutely. I love being Black. I don't love that white people were taught to hate me because of that, though. That's what I don't love. Like, that's the part. Like, I would not change me or my people for anything.
Yeah.
Like, what I hate are these systems of oppression that my peers and their family members and myself and all like that we're all upholding because we aren't willing to make someone else's experience a little bit more tangible and a little bit more conscious in our minds. Like, that's what I hate. And it's just, it's really, really, it's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then again, like to the point of burnout, it's like social workers have been preaching this for years. You know what I mean? Like therapists, psychologists, like they have been like our field. I don't think people understand our field. We're a relatively young field. So we're kind of just catching up to so many of these things. And so when I see a lot of people on social media and they're talking about like billable hours, or they're talking about, you know, the 40-hour, you know, formal gold standard or whatever of therapy, obviously there is a horrific side to this that's all about capitalism, all that kind of stuff. But again, I don't think people are really talking about this with this kind of holistic, like family system and family structure in mind. And I don't think that, again, because I think our field kind of has this like God-like ego where
big time.
We think that we're the only ones going through this. And it's like, you all like, just look at our counterparts in the psychology field, and you will see like, this is why like maybe so many people are turning away from accepting insurance, because they're bound to things like the DSM-4, they're bound to, or now 5, they're bound to things like those billing, like there are people who have already showed us like various ways that we can do this. You know what I mean? Like, but I don't know. I think right now, especially with social media, it's really popular to kind of just talk about a lot of things, and to get popular like for that. And we're doing this like parasocial, like trauma bonding. And it's like, yeah, but like, first of all, like if we do want to just take this like sloofy angle, like what are we actually going to do about it? Like, because I still have to go to work on Monday because my rent's still due on the 1st. You know what I mean? Like, or because that parent like still needs childcare because they have to go to work. Like, you know what I mean? Like, what are we actually gonna do about it? And I think that's what's really interesting. A lot of people never have answers for it because, one, in my opinion, they're not tackling the real issue, which again is white supremacy. But two, because we're so arrogant that we're not even looking at our own fields like counterparts to be like, what are they doing? Like, or maybe I should like go take like a business class and like learn a little bit more about the business structure, or, you know, whatever the case may be. It's just kind of like this circular reasoning kind of argument, in my opinion.
No, I love that. And it also, for me, it's a little validating because that's some of the work I've been trying to do recently is start kind of connecting with people from other professions. And so I'm starting to get a bunch of, I started with Dr. Malone, from the school psych realm, and I'm starting to talk to a lot more school psychologists. I've got Tierra Bland coming on. She's the founder of the Black School Psychologist Network, which incidentally just formed last year, and they are cruising. They've got a conference coming up with like some huge names. Like they're on it, but also they've got these cool things going on, like this thing called the Exposure Project, where through the School Psychology Network, where, and I'll put a link in the show notes, but basically, and it's something I think we all should be doing. And basically they're trying to get school psychology, the idea of school psychology into Black high school students and middle school students, and basically, because ABA for ABA is the common ABA stories are somebody who's autistic, or like you happen to take a course, or you saw something in the bulletin board when you got to college, but you never heard of it before that. And so I had Adrienne Bradley on, and she was just talking about how these RBT there's so many RBT jobs available that could be great to sort of get folks that are maybe first generation or whatever that are sort of struggling to find work, or struggling to sort of get into an area. Like, we have so many opportunities to build up our field, with all these other voices, and a lot of these other fields are already doing that work and have been doing it really well and been doing it for a while. Not that they're not all having struggles, and of course white supremacy is embedded deeply into those fields as well. And and any school psychologist will, any Black school psychologist will know that they work in schools, and the system of education is super white, but
it's like we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, it's already there 100%.
And even like codes of conduct and ethics codes and things like that. Like, we've got this BACB ethics code, which, I think there are some good things in that, but it's not, all encompassing in terms of ethics. And it also comes out of I think the BACB and the ABAI and most of our sort of big organizations are, they're super white centered,
100%.
And I look at sort of, I look at the BACBs and your example of sort of this DEI thing, and it makes me think of the sort of when the BACB kind of pulled out of certifying people around the world, right? That was one thing, and which I struggled with for a bunch of different reasons. But then when I discovered they were still certifying other countries in the world that were super white, so we'll still certify the UK folks, we'll still certify us in Canada, we'll still certify folks in Australia, but we're not going to certify anybody else. But in 2027, we're going to make you take a DEI credit.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, that is a perfect example of what I mean when I'm saying, like, there is this idea that just checking off almost in these, what seems to be, which I'm sure those decisions weren't necessarily, but almost in these like flippant kind of ways. So I'm like, oh, okay. Like, so, because it literally, it just reminds me, it's like, oh, okay. So you're saying like, I can't say the N-word anymore. Okay, cool. Check. I won't say that, at least not out in public. But you know what I will do is like all these other things, you know what I mean? And it's like, I don't think it's like we're still missing it. You know what I mean? It's like the bullseye is like right there, and we're just missing it. And the reality is we can. And again, especially when we tap into things like capitalism, the BACB and ABAI are a perfect example of like, these are machines that every single time we choose to get certified by them or take these verified courses, we're helping to keep the wheel spinning, right?
Yep.
And we also know that as humans, or for any intervention to be effective, it has to be potent enough. And it has to be run like to fidelity enough for it to really like be effective. That means that there would have to be so many white BCBAs saying like, oh, I'm not going to recertify this year. Like to really, or like so many people being like, oh no, like I'm not going to like recertify with whatever, like to really be like, and this is why, this is specifically why. And who cares that much? Like, if we're just really being honest, like we're the generation of the Feed the Children commercials. Do you think that like my colleagues really care that the BACB was like, nope, we're not going to go into Black countries or brown? No, because you guys weren't taught to care about that. You know what I'm saying? Like, and then also if we actually like make it just specific to Americans, we as Americans were not taught to care about that. Like, this is why people take only mission trips to these places, but they vacation in like Europe. Like it's a system. Like it is. And I think for me, that's why I'm just like, it's hard because I think we have to do things with more intention. Okay, cool. So I am going to keep my BACB credentialing. This is how I'm going to use it truly for the good. And not only on a localized sense with like my clients, or maybe not only on a localized sense with my company, but like for the greater good, how can I do that? Like, how can I leverage my privilege to even be able to certify, to even be able to take out a student loan, to go to school, to even be able to get supervision or whatever? Like, how can I really like give back? And I think because of how ableism in this case works, in our field works, we think we're giving back by simply punching in and out, working with our clients, because we still don't see them as whole people. Like, we really think that like we get off by that whole like, oh my God, like you must be so patient. Or like, oh, like we get off by that. Like, because we all have like, we just all, I think, have to really take a step back and like look in the mirror and be like, if I wasn't a BCBA, like what would I be? Or who really am I? Like, fuck, what would I be doing? But like, who am I? And then start there. But we don't do that enough. We're not taught to do that enough. And now that we're adults, of course, we're going to be more resistant to the extinction of a lot of our other behaviors, right? Like, of course. And so it's just, it's something. It's something.
Yeah. You know, that patience comment is something we hear a lot, you know, from sort of folks that aren't in the field. You're such a patient person.
Yeah.
I don't think folks realize how ableist that comment is, because it basically implies, you know, that folks with developmental disabilities should be stressing us out.
And it's like, well, and it goes again back to that whole, like, if I could be any other race, I wouldn't be. What stresses me out are you all over here, not my identity. You know what I mean? Like, and it's just, it's a very, very, and most people don't correct it. Like, most people won't just be like, well, why do you think I have a lot of patience? Like, you know what I mean? Like, most people don't probably feel comfortable kind of like throwing it back in people's faces. I do. Which is, again, why I tend to, I'm sure you've seen, I've gotten a lot of flack over the last few years, but it's like I was raised to, I always say, like, literally, before I was 10 years old, I was called the N-word. I had my first experience of true racism. Like, I went to a freaking Girl Scouts camp in Howell, Michigan, which is one of the, like, capitals of the KKK. Like, this is not new to me. You know what I mean? What is new to me is like white people being like, hey, Camille, like, can you do this presentation on it? But me experiencing it, me talking about it is not new to me at all. And I think that's why I'm just so passionate about it, because when I see all of these like businesses popping up or all of these like social media posts, I saw this post that was like, it's offensive to assume that everybody has trauma. And it's like, you completely clearly missed the point and on purpose. And by doing it, you just went viral, though. So all you're going to do is block me, like when I call you out, which this person did. But you know what I mean? It's like we're resistant to like learning new things, even as especially I think as BCBAs. And it's very, very interesting. And consequently enough, it contributes to our burnout in this whitewash sense. And in my opinion, like this very real sense.
Yeah. And something I just want to sort of take advantage of this conversation to sort of highlight, because of a conversation I had recently, was around, and it's I think it's a good example of this. So BACB pulls out of all these countries, but they still maintain, you know, all the same certifications and all whatnot. And what we're seeing now in some of these other countries is, you know, other sorts of entities coming around to sort of create some sort of certification, some sort of acknowledgement. But what we continue to do is offer the RBT credential. And what's been happening, and I don't think folks are aware of this, is that particularly with sort of organizations sort of like, you know, the Autism Partnership Group and others who are offering free RBT courses, which on the surface sounds perfect, sounds wonderful. The problem is, so I did an interview a couple weeks ago with a couple of behavior analysts in Nigeria and Ghana, and they were talking about how we've got this problem now that all of these sort of young folks are taking these free RBT courses from these American providers, or these really inexpensive RBT courses from American providers. They're getting the certification, And then they're going out and starting practices on their own. Because there's literally 1-2 behavior analysts that are certified in each of these countries, and hundreds of these RBTs that are going around doing this stuff, and it's creating problems, it's creating poor practice, and so on and so forth. And so you essentially now have this again, this sort of white-centered sort of entity in the States that has stopped providing the credential of certification of sort of board certified behavior analysts to these countries that are required to supervise these RBTs. They're not providing the RBT credential technically, so there's no requirement for supervision anymore, but they're still all allowed to take these courses. And they're still all going out now and saying I'm a registered behavior technician. And of course, in these countries, nobody knows the difference, right? You have the word, that comes off as really good. And so they're just hammering more nails. And
even here, thinking about, again, if we're thinking about this as a machine and we're thinking about this as a system, number one, we just, in my opinion, don't talk about capitalism and classism enough. So first of all, we think about if the BACB did like a demographic on class, and it would very clearly show that RBTs are likely going to be in the lower class. And then within that lower class, of course, you're going to see the exact same thing we see up top. It's going to be a majority Black and brown RBTs, right? Okay. But even with that, when we think about capitalism, and again, this is not towards any company or anything like that, but when we think about capitalism, we know that companies make money off of RBTs. So I don't think, and this is my personal opinion, and this is not towards any one person or any one company. I just don't think it was an accident, or that it was for just the greater good of all to make something like the RBT course free. If we're thinking about this again, as all of us are these spokes on the wheel. And so again, not to say that that I just believe in impact over intent, right? Even with kind of the way the credential of the RBT is right now, I know for me, the way I was taught to work with my clients before there was even an RBT credential, the standard was very, very high in a way that I'm personally concerned about with the way that the field is going right now. But also thinking about the dynamic that insurance kind of places on us, that the most least credentialed person is the person having the direct contact with the marginalized person. And by marginalized, I mean within the client practitioner relationship. That doesn't seem off to anybody. That doesn't seem weird. You know what it actually seems like? I'll tell you. It literally, to me, has this resemblance of in slavery, where it was my slaves could nurse my white babies. My slaves could take care of my white babies and all that. But will they actually get paid? No. Will they actually have safety? No. Will they actually have protections over them? No. Will they actually have, and that's what I'm saying. And that's, again, the way I think. That's why I can't entertain the way that these conversations surrounding burnout are going, because it's deeper than this white people coming up with this term called quiet quitting. It's deeper than that. It's deeper than I have X amount of kids on my caseload and I can't balance it. It's deeper, it's deeper than that. And until, for me at least, we're willing to really start to look at how history is literally just doing nothing but repeating itself, I don't think we're ever really gonna get ahead of this. You know what I mean? We're not going to get ahead of this. And again, if we would just look at our brothers and sisters in other fields, we would see more things that we maybe should be doing to try to combat some of this stuff. But I don't know. It's the way that we are kind of tackling all of this is very, very individualized. And that's because whiteness is an individualistic kind of culture. Whereas speaking, at least for the Black community, But definitely from what I understand about like the indigenous community as well, for example, we are a communal people. And so I think when people think about like DEI, or they think about, at least my definition of burnout, we're trying to combat individualism with community, and those in this respect, I don't know how well that they're going to be able to coexist. And so again, I just don't think we're really kind of talking about this in the way that, you know, we really should, for it to be the most impactful.
Zigzag is an autism therapy management platform. At its core, Zigzag seamlessly allows management of programs, adding, editing, changing long-term and short-term objectives on the go. Zigzag makes data collection super easy for therapists on site and automatically calculates progress, providing you with session summaries and graphs in real time. Zigzag provides you the ability to manage all of your clients, whether they be center or home-based, and work with all the various therapists and parents seamlessly. Zigzag is based in Vancouver, British Columbia, and is fully compliant with both federal and provincial privacy requirements. Book a demo now at www.zigzagkid.com/product demo and get a free 30-day trial. The third secret word is realistic. And it's funny, not funny, but it was just funny for me that you bring it back around to that, because about the sort of communal piece. You were talking about how it would be so nice if we could kind of do that experiment and create that utopia where none of these things are happening. I saw a little bit of that utopia yesterday. Guy I had on the podcast, episode 37, Grant Bruno, indigenous guy from northern Alberta, from a community called Muscatchees in Alberta, and he's a father of 2 autistic boys. And we talked about sort of autism in First Nations. He's just released a short documentary, which I'm going to put a link in. I think everyone should check out. It's only 18 minutes long. It's called The Gift of Being Different. And it was filmed by a Métis filmmaker, and Grant. And it's a story about his son, but also about their community, also about the First Nation and the ceremony and whatnot. He talks a lot about how the indigenous ceremony, as it's called, which is a sort of an umbrella term for sort of all of the different kind of ceremonial activities that they go through, spiritual connecting and so on, is the most inclusive context that exists. So he says, when basically in the community, when you hear a ceremony is happening, you don't need to be invited. Everyone goes. It doesn't matter who. You're hearing about it means you're in. And he's actually working, and he's actually doing some research around sort of some kind of different kinds of sensory adaptations. So maybe around sort of the sounds of the drums, or the types of tobacco that's being used, or where it's being used, and so on and so forth, but not changing anything, just more letting folks be aware that some of those things could trigger folks in different ways and whatnot. But they don't have words for disability. They don't have words for deficit, the deficit discourse, as he describes it. And in a lot of ways, it really is this utopia where kind of none of this stuff is going. All good. Yeah. And so, I do again, circling back.
Yeah.
The privileged white-centered society we live in, capitalist society that we live in, was destined to never be inclusive. And so the idea that we want to push for diversity, equity, inclusion just is never going to happen.
Well, especially because if companies were being honest, they wouldn't make the profit sustainably that they probably are now if they actually got that. And I think that's what I'm saying. Like, I think people would be more than happy to just put things on their website But true inclusion, for example, would be us like pushing back on insurance companies for requiring a formal diagnosis. True inclusion would be us pushing back on insurance companies for requiring that the diagnosis be autism, but like no other disability would be covered by their insurance for ABA. True inclusion would be asking, why do you reimburse the RBT or the behavior technician rate at this much, but not the other, people like BCBAs, BCABAs, so on and so forth at this rate? Like true inclusion would be, I don't know, like maybe not building, like a Fortune 500 ABA company in a gentrified area, but maybe actually going to like doing some like demographic research on like who may like really can benefit from these services and like also considering like building it there. True inclusion would be us collaborating with people like school psychologists and school counselors to see how we can like educate on both ends, like in a bi-directional way, and we can like get in schools and have insurance cover it in school. Like it would be having, I don't know, diverse people on your DEI board of your company, but also having diverse people just in leadership, period, because DEI may not even be in my scope of competence just because I'm Black.
Yes.
Like having like just, it really is a matter of like from the quote unquote bottom up, having everyone be seen and affirmed every step of the way, in ways that, like you said, to the point, capitalism, like would it work? Like I was looking on TikTok and I was so moved, this person, without even knowing it, and I don't know if it's still a trend, this is a while ago, but without knowing it, she kind of started this trend about bartering. And I don't think people really understand like goods and bartering is actually how we can like dissect from capitalism. But she was like, hey, like I'm in need of, I can't remember, like, I don't know, like a fax machine. I don't know. It's 2023. I don't know if she needed a fax machine. But she's like, hey, I'm in need of a fax machine. I don't have any money, but I'm a really good baker. Like, and this is what my cakes look like, this, that, and the other. And so she ended up like, I think she was in New York City. She ended up like meeting with somebody in New York City. And that's how they like exchange like the goods and I'm like, that's really what it's about, which again goes against our ethics code in so many ways. I mean, there are these like caveats to bartering and, if that's allowed. But again, it's like, we have to think about in a very communal way, in ways that most people don't understand. Like, it's just, and so again, it's like, no, like miss me with the like burnout, like Zoom calls where again, we're like in a parasocial way, kind of like trauma bonding over these mutual complaints that may not even be complaints if we really understood the system, because then we'd understand how privileged we are to even have a Zoom, let alone a complaint. Like, let's actually talk about the community or the communities that we're supposed to be serving, because they are the marginalized in this context, not me, the person with a master's degree. And again, that's not to say that like I don't have complaints. That's not to say that there may be things that, are valid in all this stuff, but like take that shit to your therapist and think about who you're really talking to and who's seeing this. Like, it's just, we're not, I'm sorry, I'm getting all like, but it drives me insane that like, it is so much deeper than this. And the consequence of us not realizing that is significant harm to people. Myself, Dr. Danielle Beals, Dr. Natalie Williams-Audea, Kelsey Secco, and Emily Keller, I believe. And I'm sorry, I'm like blanking on names right now. We did a research project a few years ago or a couple years ago, and it was about this burnout. And what we realized is like, maybe this isn't burnout, maybe it's actually trauma. And who we actually, our research ended up kind of centering were like the RBTs, like were the clients. And it was just such a beautiful thing. Dr. Williams-Audea is the one who proposed the research and brought us in for the study, because she gets it in a way that I think is so ahead of the times right now. And I really, really hope that more people follow her work on Instagram. I believe her Instagram page is Left of Center, but I highly suggest that people look up her work, because she really understands like centering who needs to be centered in a lot of these conversations. And she completely is like divested from this the way I'm wording it, like this whitewashed way of talking about this, because she sees it. Like she's a whole PhD and was like working as an RBT before she got her BCBA. And not in this like like glorifying way, but in a real, like, don't think just because I have a PhD in this whole other like study or this whole other field that like I should just come in as like the supervisor. You know what I mean? When I don't know anything about maybe this client or this case or whatever. Her work, I mean, I talk a lot all the time about Dr. Danielle Beal's work, Dr. Nasia's work, like Denisha's work, like I think all of our work is really talking about this. And I really, really hope that people will like read it and support our work, because not in this like shameless plug kind of way, but in this very real, like we're talking about like the human experience in a way that I think is a little bit more effective than other ways that are being proposed that we kind of deal with burnout in particular, but you know, some of these other things as well.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I know we're running out of time. I know you got a place to be.
We are.
I just wanted to maybe take just a minute or two if you have it, just to talk about some of the current stuff. I know you've recently taken on the role of mentorship coordinator at BABA.
Yes.
And which is super awesome. And also you'll be running the beauty shop at the BABA conference coming up in June.
Yes.
Wonder if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what you're doing at BABA and what's going on for folks.
Yeah. So you're right. I am BABA's mentorship chair. Mentorship is something, again, thinking back about our conversation on community, it is something that is so ancestral for Black people across the diaspora. We believe in that whole, like it takes a village. And to me, that's what mentorship really is. It's this village approach. And so we offer monthly mentorship right now, where anyone can be a mentor. I want it to be a bi-directional relationship where, you know, just because you may feel like you need mentorship in this case, that I want people to remember that they also can be mentors if that's something that they feel comfortable with doing. Eventually, we have hopes to have more individual, like one-on-one mentorship. But we just had our first group mentorship last week, and it was just so awesome. It was just Black clinicians really coming together to talk about how we can really take care of ourselves while doing the work that we do. So that was awesome. I'm not sure off the top of my head the date of next month's mentorship, but we'll be putting out promotion for that. And then, so the beauty shop, I'm doing another workshop. Well, I was too shy last year to do it as a workshop. This year to be a workshop. My thought for the beauty shop is that I wanted to simulate what, as a staple, the beauty in the barbershop is for Black people. I want it to be like that. So it is just a commitment, I think, from Black person to Black person to hold space for each other and our experiences, to love on each other, to call each other in and things like that. Legally, I can't say only Black people, can come to that workshop, but that workshop will absolutely be centering Black people and our experiences. And so I'm really, really excited about that. I was so touched by like the feedback that I got from it last year. So I am very, very excited that BABA selected it as one of the workshops this year. So cool. I'm excited.
Yeah. Awesome. That sounds really cool. Okay. I know we got to wrap up. Cammie, thanks so much for coming on, as well as an excellent conversation. And, I know we could have easily made this a 3-hour conversation and I would have been so happy to do it, but I know you got to get going. So thanks for being on, and we'll definitely have you back.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.
Yeah, you too.
Bye.